Begin our look at the physiology of the nervous system by taking a look at the organization of the nervous system and get an idea for the overall structure of the nervous system and kind of a review of its anatomy a little bit. So when we look at the nervous system, we have two major components. We have the central nervous system, and then we have the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system has our processing capabilities for the nervous system. And so we have our brain, which is our major processor, and then the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is essentially everything that is outside of the central nervous system. So anything that occurs and happens outside of the brain or the spinal cord is happening within the peripheral nervous system itself. And so we have all of our nerves that go out and give us conscious awareness of touch and feel and our special senses and control of motor in terms of our skeletal muscle, all comes from our cranial nerves and our spinal nerves for information that's there. Contained within those as well, we have a couple of the other components for things like our internal organs. We have our enteric nervous system that's going to give us information about where things are and what's going on inside the digestive tract, the heart and lungs and things like that. And then we also have individual receptors. These receptors can be on places like the skin. These can be on places like the eye, the ear, for all of our sensation that we're getting information about, as well as internal receptors that can be in places like the digestive tract as well. So the nervous system, kind of a flow of information, especially when it kind of comes to information coming in. We begin with a receptor. So some sort of receptor has detected that something has happened or something has changed within the body itself. Those sensory receptors then send their information up to the central nervous system. So they're on their way to go into the central nervous system, traveling through the various spinal nerves or cranial nerves to get back into the central nervous system itself. So we've got to get ourselves back there so that we can process the information as it comes in. Once we're into either the spinal cord or the brain, we can start that processing within the central nervous system itself. Sometimes that processing is very minimal for things like reflexes. Sometimes it's very much more complex for thought and processing of higher level learning, things like that. Once we're processing that information then becomes a process where we need to send that information back out. Depending upon the type of information, that information is going to go through some sort of motor division. And so that on the motor side of things, this is either going to be conscious or unconscious. And so the somatic nervous system is our conscious side. The autonomic nervous system is our unconscious side. So if we see something that we want, that receptor was something that we heard, or we're even hungry, something like that, or thirsty, and our motor side is going to be on the somatic side to go out and go get it, move our body in order so that we can get to the thing that we want. Versus the autonomic system, this is going to very much depend upon kind of where we go from here. And so for the somatic side, that's going to go to our conscious muscle, our skeletal muscle. But on the autonomic side, this is going to go down one of two pathways, either the parasympathetics or the sympathetic division, depending upon what type of information it is that we need to send out. And so these two are opposing one another. And so if the parasympathetics are making something go up, the sympathetics, in a sense, are going to make something go down. And so they're going to oppose one another. So they can't really work at the same time. If the parasympathetics are, in a sense, dominating, the sympathetics are going to become inhibited. And that's then going to control everything from smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, send information out to adipose tissue. We can get all that information going out and sent to them in order to kind of tell us what we need at that particular time. Again, parasympathetics are, in a sense, our rest and digest. Sympathetics are our fight or flight side of the system. So for the parasympathetics, rest and digest, it's going to increase things like digestion. It's going to decrease things like heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure. And then for the sympathetics, everything is going to be just the opposite. So we're going to decrease digestion. We're going to increase heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure, all the opposite of what we had for parasympathetics. So the central nervous system is our main processing place. And so central nervous system contains the brain and the spinal cord. This is going to have all of our interneurons there available for processing of information. It's going to essentially come to a conclusion about that sensory information that came in. And so it's going to take all of that peripheral nervous system, that information that comes in. So we take our PNS information, process it, and decide what we need to go and do with it, and then send it from the central nervous system back out to the peripheral nervous system on the way out. The peripheral nervous system is more like a two-way highway. And so we have afferent pathways or fibers, and then we have efferent pathways or fibers. And so they're going in opposite directions. And so one is going in one direction in a sense, and the other is going in the opposite direction. And so for our afferents, this is carrying information from the peripheral nervous system back towards the central nervous system. So this is going toward the central nervous system. That information is making its way back for processing. Efferent pathways or fibers are carrying information away from the central nervous system. So it's going from the central nervous system out to some sort of effector organ. And so it's going to muscle tissues or glands, organs, things like that. So the efferents are on their way towards the PNS. Our afferents are on the way towards the CNS. And so they're going in opposite directions to one another. And then in between, in a sense, we're going to loop that information back around. And so we're always aware of what's going on in either system. Functionally, we can organize the peripheral nervous system into essentially sensory versus motor. And so again, this comes down to afferents versus efferents. Sensory information is all of that information that's generally coming from receptors. And so that those receptors that are in the skin, the joints, the organs, anything and everything that has information about what's happening to or inside the body has this information being sent through afferent fibers. This can be further divided up into either somatics or visceral. And so the somatic side of things is, again, everything that we're, in a sense, conscious of. And so this is information that we can touch. This is information that we can feel. This is information about light touch, deep touch, vibration, vision, hearing, taste, smell, all of our five senses. And so all of those senses are sending conscious information back about what we're experiencing in the world. Visceral sensory information is unconscious. So this is unconscious information. This is the stuff that, in a sense, we kind of don't ever have to think about. And so this is information that's coming from places like our blood vessels. This is information coming from our about what's inside those blood vessels, which may then affect things like the heart and the lungs. This is information that's coming from our digestive tract, as far as for processing the food that's going through it, things like that. All of this visceral information, for the most part, we have absolutely no idea what that information is that's being processed. We may have some conscious awareness about certain things as far as that goes. And so we may get thirsty at times, or we may be aware that our heart is beating faster, or that our lungs are filling more often because we're breathing more rapidly. But the actual stimulus itself, we're not aware of that information whatsoever. On the motor side of things, once again, we're going to divide up into either somatic or autonomic. And so again, this is conscious versus unconscious information. For the somatic side of things, this is going to be controlling skeletal muscle. So these are efferent fibers. These are once again going away from the central nervous system towards the effector organs, things like muscles and to the body itself in terms of our glands and things like that as well. But for the somatic side, this is all voluntary. We can control when to start and stop, in a sense, that movement. And so we can control when to begin it, when to end it, how long to contract it, things like that. And so we have control over that particular muscle itself. The autonomic side of things, this is now involuntary. We have no control over this information that's there. And this is going to regulate everything from heart rate, breathing rate, um, blood glucose levels, calcium levels, etc. All those different things are happening within the autonomic side of things, and we don't have any kind of control over it. The effector organs themselves are everything that is, in a sense, not skeletal muscle. So this is smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, our things like sweat glands in the body, our endocrine organs, all of these different organs themselves, we don't have any conscious control over it. We can't slow down our heart rate just by thinking about it. We can't slow down our breathing rate when we're out of breath just by thinking about it. We've got to allow the autonomic system, in a sense, to do its job in performing those processes themselves. So when we look at kind of the general idea of the nervous system, we have some sort of sensory receptor that's sending us information about something that has happened out in the periphery of the body, so outside of the central nervous system. Its information comes back. The cell body of that neuron is generally going to sit just outside of the spinal cord, depending upon where we are, or just outside the brainstem, depending upon the information that's coming in about it. That information then has to come into the central nervous system, generally, again, the cord, depending upon what we're talking about, or the brainstem. That information then synapses on another neuron, and this neuron here is a interneuron. So we have our afferent neuron that is sending information towards the central nervous system. We have our efferent neuron that is sending information away from the central nervous system. And for all of the connections that are happening in the central nervous system, we have the interneuron, neither an afferent or an efferent neuron. This is the connection between the two sides of the system, in a sense. That sensory neuron, that afferent neuron, can have information that goes elsewhere as well. And so it may go and tell other things about that sensory information that came in. The interneuron is not just going to synapse again on a single motor neuron. So the efferent neuron that is going out, that one motor neuron that is there, that's not necessarily going to synapse just on that one cell, but it may synapse on a whole host of cells in order to control that particular muscle or gland that it needs to. And that information then heads from the central nervous system out to our effector organ. And so it's going to make its way out to the effector organs themselves. And again, we're going to control either a smooth muscle or a skeletal muscle or a cardiac muscle or some sort of gland in the process. One of the basics as far as the steps goes for this process can be seen in things like a flexor reflex. And so when we touch something that is painful, that gives us a painful stimulus, we draw back from it, we pull away from it. And in order to do that, we utilize flexor muscles. And so in our body, we have this flexor reflex. That afferent information is going to head back into the cord. And so its cell body, as I mentioned before, sits just outside the cord. And in this case, it's sitting inside the dorsal root ganglion or the posterior root ganglion. That nerve then synapses on our interneuron. That interneuron then is going to send information right back out via motor. So our efferents are going to head back out on the way. And that information is also going to be sent up the cord, so where we have conscious awareness that that has occurred. And so this is going to head up towards the brain. And then once it hits the brain, we're going to eventually have the conscious awareness that something has happened at that point. When the interneuron synapses on our effector neuron, on our motor neurons, it can either be excitatory or inhibitory. So it can cause that muscle to become stimulated to contract, or it can cause a muscle to become stimulated to not contract. So we can have inhibition there. And in something like a flexor reflex, that's just what happens. And so the elbow flexors become stimulated, the elbow extensors become inhibited. We stop them from being able to contract so that we can do flexion of the elbow itself. And so that's required in order for that to occur. So the output of the processes here, when we go out towards the effector organs themselves, we have the ability to either stimulate them or inhibit them based upon the needs at that time. Quick little look at nerves themselves. And so nerves are similar to that of things like muscles in that they're kind of packaged up. And so we have the outermost covering to a general nerve. So if we were to look at it on a cadaver, something like that, we would see the epineurium. That's the portion that we're actually seeing on the nerves themselves. That then bundles up individual fascicles. So we have these big bundles that are inside here called a fascicle. The fascicles are then surrounded by perineurium. And so the perineurium surrounds that individual fascicle. And inside there, inside a fascicle, we then have individual nerve fibers for each axon. And so those nerve fibers are then once again surrounded by another connective tissue covering called the endoneurium. And so the endoneurium then surrounds it as well. And so that creates this kind of packaging inside. And so we've got this big bundle with a whole bunch of what we could almost think of as wires inside, and they're all going to different places. They're all on their way to wherever it is that they need to go. This may be a nerve that's headed towards a muscle, and each of those individual axons are going to go stimulate the particular motor unit that they're associated with. So it's going to be all of the muscle cells that it actually controls. And then the other axons in here are controlling other portions of that muscle as well, or gland, or whatever it happens to be. Where those sensory neurons come back in towards the cord, the cell bodies of those neurons lie within an area where we have a collection of those cell bodies. And so this is where, as we come back in towards the spinal cord, so this would be our afferents heading back in, this would be efferents heading back out, they create a little bit of a bulge called a ganglion. So this was that posterior root or dorsal root ganglion that we saw on the other slide. And this creates this extra mass, in a sense, on the nerve as it's coming in towards the cord itself. And so going back out here, we're going to have our sensory kind of coming in here and our motor going out this way. And then it blends as it makes its way out towards its final destination as it's going. So ganglions are generally going to be that area where typically outside a nerve, or outside the cord, we're going to see this bundle as the nerve comes in. In addition, we have the connection from one neuron to the next, and this will bring us into our next topic as well, where we have the synapse. And so where one neuron needs to communicate with another neuron or an effector organ, we're going to have this light connection between them where the presynaptic neuron has the ability to communicate with the postsynaptic neuron. So the synapse itself is that space that lies in between. So we have this synaptic cleft here. This is a fluid-filled space. And it's within there where we're going to release neurotransmitter and allow for communication to move from one to the next. So that allows this first neuron to communicate with this next cell, and then the cell's going to do something. It's either going to become stimulated or it's going to become inhibited, depending upon what that particular neurotransmitter and receptor does between the two. And we'll talk about that more later on in coming videos.